pruning flowers. Our task is to complete the function provided so that it outputs a text string with any duplicate flowers removed. Remember, your program must work with other inputs or it will be marked incorrect. So, for example, if the input that is given into the program is daisy space ivy space rose space ivy space tulip, what the program should do is find any repeated flower names, so any duplicate flowers. In this case, ivy is actually repeated. We have it here for the first time and here for the second time. And what should happen is our program should get rid of this second repetition and just output each flower once. In many questions, we will get an instruction like this, which is do not alter the blocks provided. So this program has been, or this canvas has been set up in a way where there is a function that does a specific thing, and then to test it, they execute the function with a certain input. What they mean here is that our program should work for any inputs where we give flower names and some of them are repeated, not just daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, tulip. So if we add another rose at the end, the output should be the same. It should remove that repeated rose. Now, it's fine to move these blocks around to kind of make space for what we want to write, but we shouldn't change any of them. Not the input, not their names. We leave all that as it is. Let's discuss what these blocks actually mean first. Here, we are creating a function. This is a block of code that we can run with a certain input, and it gives us a certain output. So it's like a certain machine where you give it some data and it gives out some data. For example, in here, the input is flowers and it returns pruned flowers. Then, to actually use this function, once we have written it, we use this execute block. Execute the function called prune flowers with the input flowers being this. Daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, tulip, and this is our example input. Now here we're going to have to discuss a bit of data types. So when we are programming, the data that is stored in different ways. They said, for example, our output should be a text string. This means our output should be some piece of text. So just like here, this is just a piece of text made up of different words, different letters. Now, the input is also a piece of text, and it's a few words separated by spaces. To deal with this string, with this piece of text, it would be easier to split up these words and look at them individually. What we can do to actually do something like that is we can use a list. A list is just a collection of different items. So, I can create a list with numbers. I can say create a list with the number 0, with the number 50, and with the number 20. Now, when I create the list, I need to actually store it somewhere. I need to create a variable, and this is just a place where we store data. So we give it a name so we remember what it is, and we just can access it later on at different parts of the program. So over here, you can create a variable. So I might name my list numbers, and I say set. I click on here to show the menu, and I say set numbers to create list with 0, 50, 20. So numbers is a collection of 3 different numbers, 0, 50, and 20. In our case, we're actually going to need to create a list with, let's call it a flower list. I've used an underscore between the different words. In block-based programming, you can use spaces, but it's just considered better practice to use underscores. So flower list. And in our case, the flower list should be made up of daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, tulip. So I could, open up the text and do daisy and add ivy, rose. Of course, we can click on the blue cog to add more items into the list if we want to. But this means that I can only deal with this specific collection of flowers. Whereas I want my program to deal with other inputs, or it will be marked incorrect. So this is not how I will be creating my list. I'm going to set flower list to, well, what I need to do is take this piece of text and split up the individual words into separate items in my list. And there's a very nice method of doing that in block-based programming. It's this block in lists. It says make list from text. So let's use that. Make list from text. I need to specify what the text is. So in this case, the text is stored in the input variable flowers, right? That's why when we execute it, we say flowers is daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, tulip. So I'm going to go to my variables. I'm going to search for flowers, and I'm going to use it here. The delimiter is us telling the program what is separating these elements in the text. So if we look over here, what is separating the first word and the second word? Daisy and ivy. By default, they put a comma, but actually in our case, there's no comma separating the two words. What separates them is a single space. So in here, I'm going to delete the comma, and I'm going to type a single space. Make sure you do that. So I'm going to do a backspace just to show you. This is what an empty text is. A single space looks like this. So we're saying we're creating a flower list from this text by splitting up the words using the spaces in between. So that means daisy is going to be a separate element, then ivy is going to be a separate element, then rose, then ivy again, and then tulip. Now, what I need to do is go through this list and check which of these are actually repeated. Now, one way to then kind of check or store those that are not repeated, or rather a single occurrence of each one, is to create a new list. Call it pruned list. So this is what our flowers will look like as a list after we have removed the repetitions. So I'm going to set the pruned list. Well, we're going to start it off as an empty list. So just to go over it again, we have a flower list, which is made up of 5 items if we use this input: daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, tulip. Then we have a pruned list, which starts off as empty, and then as we go along, we want to enter all the flowers without repeating any of them. So in the Loops tab, we're going to see something that we haven't actually seen before, which is this loop. So this one was repeating a certain number of times. This is for repeating while some certain condition is true. This one repeats for each item in a list. So if I do something in here, it's going to be repeated 5 times because I have 5 elements in my list. So the first time this loop runs, I is going to be the first element of the list. Let's first make sure that we are using the correct list, which is flower list. So the first time it runs, I is going to be daisy. The second time it runs, I is going to be ivy. Third time is going to be rose. Fourth is ivy. And the last time it runs, it's going to be tulip. And basically what we want to check is when we are adding these flowers from the flower list into our pruned list, we need to make sure that we're adding them for the first time, because we don't want repetition in the pruned list. So to do this, we're going to use one of the list functions that says, in a given list, find the first occurrence of an item. So in here, we're searching in the list pruned list, and we want to find the first occurrence of each flower that we're looping through. So we're going to put I. This means in the list pruned list, find the first occurrence of that item. So for example, if it's starting off with daisy, it says find the first occurrence of daisy in the pruned list. But the pruned list starts off as empty. So actually, it doesn't find the first occurrence, which means this will give me a value of 0. Because usually it would give me the value, or what we call the index, of the item in the list, which is its position. So for example, if I use the flower list and I say find the first occurrence of, let's do daisy. I'm saying in the flower list, find the first occurrence of the item daisy. So it goes through this list and it finds Daisy, the first occurrence of Daisy, as the first element in the list. So this will give a value of 1. If I tell it to find the first occurrence of Ivy in the list, this will give a value of 2. Rose will be 3. If I say Ivy again, well, it's always going to be 2 because I'm telling it to find the first occurrence, and so on. But if I tell it, for example, to find the first occurrence of jasmine, which is a type of flower, but it's not in our flower list, this is going to give a value 0 because jasmine is not in the list. So just to go back to what we want to do, we're saying in the list of pruned flowers, find the first occurrence of that flower from our flower list. Now, if it's not already in the pruned list, then add it. We want it there. So if this equals 0, as in it's not in the pruned list, let's add it to the pruned list. Well, how do we check if this is 0? Let's listen back to what I said. If this is 0, if we go to logic and we find the if statement. If this is equal to 0, so we're going to use this block to say if the first occurrence of that flower in the pruned list is 0, let's make sure it goes in the right place, then add it to the pruned list. And we do that by going to lists and we say in the list, and in this case we're using the pruned list, we're going to insert. We always want to add it as the last element, right? Because, for example, if we check Daisy, we want to add Daisy at the end, then Ivy. I don't want Ivy to go before Daisy in my pruned list. I want to add it after, so I'm going to add it at the end. So in list, pruned list, insert at the very end, at the last position, this flower I that I couldn't find in the pruned list. So I'm going to go to my variables, find I, and add it to the list. So let's just do a quick summary of what's happened so far. We created a flower list by taking this text and then splitting up any two things that were separated by a space. So that means we got 5 different elements, 5 different words: daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, and tulip. Then we created an empty list, which we called pruned list. And we said, go through the flower list, and for each element, check if it's in the pruned list. If it's not, then add it. If it is, well, we're not going to do anything because we didn't add an else statement, and we don't need one here. So let's just think about what exactly is going to happen. It's going to go to Daisy as the first element in the flower list. It's going to check, is Daisy in the pruned list? So it does. In list, pruned list, find the first occurrence of Daisy. Since it's an empty list, then it's not going to find Daisy, and it is going to be equal to 0. So it's going to add Daisy to the pruned list. So now the flower list has daisy, ivy, rose, ivy, tulip, and the pruned list has daisy. Then this repeats again, right? That's what we used this for loop for. It repeats again, but this time I is the second element in the flower list. It's ivy. And it checks the same thing. Is ivy in the pruned list? Well, no, the pruned list only has daisy at this point. So if it hasn't found it, then add it. So now the pruned list has daisy and ivy. And then it goes back and goes to the next item in the list, rose. Is rose in the pruned list? No, it's not. It's only daisy and ivy in the pruned list. Well, then add rose to the pruned list. So it does that. Now it gets to ivy. It checks, is ivy in the pruned list? This time it is. So let's check actually what's happening here. In list pruned list, find the first occurrence of ivy. Remember, this time I is ivy. So it goes here and it finds the first occurrence of ivy, and that's at position 2 in the list. So the first occurrence of ivy is 2. It checks, is 2 equal to 0? Well, it's not. So this condition is false. So it does not do this. It does not add ivy to the end of the list because it's already there and we don't want repetitions. And so it goes back and repeats for the last element, which is tulip. Is tulip in the pruned list? It's not, so add it, and this is what we get. But the issue is, this currently pruned list is a list. But when we output, we need to output a text string with any duplicate flowers removed. So we don't want to output a list, we want to output a string. So we kind of want to do the opposite of this. Instead of taking a text and making it a list, we want to do the opposite. I want to create a text from the list. And in fact, this same function, if we go to lists and we find it over here, you can swap the order around. I can make a text from a list. The text that I want to create is from the list pruned list. That's the one with no repetition. So I'm going to go to variables, find pruned list. When I create the text, I want the words to be separated by a space. So again, I'm going to change my delimiter to a single space. Now, when it returns, so when this function gives the output, it gives it as pruned flowers. That's the variable they want us to use. So I go to my variables and I say set, make sure this is outside the loop, because we don't want this to repeat every time. We want this to happen at the end, after we've gone through every single element and checked if it's repeated and added it to the pruned list. So I'm going to set pruned flowers to this text, which is made up from the list pruned list, and separate the words with a space. And then that gives me this output. So I run my program and hopefully we haven't made any errors. Daisy, ivy, rose, tulip, no repetitions, and it says my answer is correct. So that brings us to the end, or rather the last question from the 4-mark question.